I woke up to the sound of metal grinding against asphalt and a voice yelling something about non-compliant tires. I shot out of bed, rushed to the window, and stared in disbelief as a tow truck operator hooked up my truck, the same one I parked neatly in my driveway every day for the last 6 years. I sprinted outside in my pajamas, heart racing, only to see a woman in oversized sunglasses and a leopard print blouse standing triumphantly with her arms folded. She looked like the final boss of a reality show no one wanted to watch. "You were warned," she sneered. "That vehicle violates HOA Code 14C. Consider this a courtesy." I looked around at my open fields, my unpaved road, and my gate that literally said private property. I wasn't even in an HOA. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. It had all started innocently enough about 2 weeks prior. I had come home from a long supply run for the farm and noticed an envelope taped to my gate. Thinking it was a missed delivery notice, I grabbed it and opened it while still walking to the house. My brain did a double take at the heading. Violation notice. It listed an unpaid community dues balance of over $1,000 along with several fines for violations like mismatched fence design, non-neutral paint color, and overgrown wildflowers. I laughed. Literally stood in the middle of my driveway and laughed like a maniac. Because I didn't live in any HOA. My property was clearly marked as independent and exempt back when I bought it. That's why I bought it. I figured it was a clerical error and didn't think much of it until a second envelope showed up, then a third. Each one was more aggressive. The fourth came with a bright red sticker warning of potential lien action. That's when I started to get annoyed. Still, I kept it civil. I wrote a formal email to the sender address on the letters and attached my property deed and exemption paperwork. I even dropped off a printed copy at the community office that had somehow popped up at the edge of the new subdivision nearby. I handed it to a bored-looking teenager at the front desk and left it at that. That weekend, I was doing fence repairs when I saw her for the first time. She marched right up to my gate like she had a badge and a mission. I had to laugh again because she looked exactly like every Karen meme I'd ever seen online. She didn't introduce herself. Just started talking. "This property is currently delinquent in community assessment. I'm here to give you a chance to resolve that voluntarily before we escalate." I blinked a few times. "I'm sorry, who exactly are you?" She finally said her name, Karen, of course, and that she was the HOA president of the neighboring development. I told her she had the wrong person. I didn't live in her HOA, and she had no jurisdiction here. That's when she pulled out a clipboard like it was the Constitution and pointed to a printed map. "Your plot was included in the revised HOA expansion vote last quarter. You're part of the Red Cedar Trails community now." I nearly choked. "Red Cedar what? No, I'm not. This land predates your entire neighborhood." She smirked. "The board voted. It passed unanimously. Welcome to the community." I didn't say anything right away. I just stared at her for a second to make sure she was serious. Then I slowly closed the gate in her face. She shouted something about late fees and assessments as I walked away. I thought that would be the end of it. But no. It was just the beginning. A few days later, one of my motion cameras picked up someone stapling paper notices to my trees and mailbox posts. It was the HOA again. This time they were claiming that my gravel driveway needed to be paved, that my barn exceeded height restrictions, and that my solar panels were aesthetic disruptions. I decided it was time to put everything in a folder and hand it to my lawyer friend Sam. Sam looked at the papers and nearly spit out his coffee. "They actually tried to annex your land into an HOA without your consent. That's not even legal unless you sign something." I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't even spoken to most of those people. Sam drafted a cease and desist that basically told them to stay the hell off my land and stop pretending I was part of their delusional rulebook. Which brings us to this morning. Karen had called a tow truck on my vehicle. The truck wasn't even on a public road. It was on my land, my driveway, behind my gate. I ran out barefoot and stood in front of the front tires. The tow guy was just doing his job, but looked increasingly uncomfortable. She told me this was HOA property, he said. I pointed to the street sign that clearly said private road. Then I pointed to the no trespassing sign. Then I pointed to Karen. If you touch this truck, that's trespassing and theft. On private land. I will have you arrested, and then I will sue. The guy unhooked it and muttered an apology. Karen screamed at him, threatened to sue him, and he drove away without another word. Karen stood there fuming, literally shaking. You can't keep fighting this. You will comply. The HOA has rights. I didn't say anything. I just pulled out my phone and hit play on the security footage. It showed Brent, her little clipboard-carrying henchman, hopping my fence 2 days ago and taping fake citations to my barn door. Her face paled slightly. That's private video. That's not admissible. I smiled. That's trespass, Karen. That's illegal. She stormed off, yelling something about escalating this to the HOA board. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to ignore this anymore. I was going to go deeper. Find out what this HOA really was, who she really was, how far they were willing to go, and more importantly, how to end this circus before it swallowed more people than just me. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. I'd seen the look in her eyes. The way she barked orders and assumed ownership. If she was bold enough to try annexing my land, who else had she targeted? Who else had quietly paid those made-up fees? Scared or unsure if they could fight back, I wasn't going to let that happen again. It was time to tear down her paper empire. One fake citation at a time. The day after the tow truck incident, I drove straight to the city records office with a folder full of every letter, notice, and video I had collected. I had a gut feeling that Karen was bluffing, but I wanted official proof that her HOA had absolutely zero authority over my property. The clerk behind the desk, an older man with a calm voice and a deep knowledge of zoning laws, spent 10 minutes pulling up property maps and district lines. Then he leaned back and let out a long whistle. Son, your property isn't even within 3 blocks of their official boundary. Their jurisdiction ends at Oak Creek. You're way beyond it. They have no legal leg to stand on. I asked if there had been any petitions or recorded expansions involving my land. He shook his head. Only the city council can approve something like that, and they haven't approved a thing in over 2 years. That was the moment I knew Karen hadn't just made a mistake, she had made a calculated move. Feeling both vindicated and furious, I called Sam again. He was already expecting me. I handed over the city records, the camera footage, and all the HOA notices. He went through them like a kid on Christmas morning. You know what this is? This is textbook harassment. But more than that, it's fraud. She's issuing fines and pretending to have jurisdiction over you, hoping you'll just pay up to make her go away. That's extortion, man. He drafted a formal cease and desist letter within the hour, and we sent it to the HOA's official mailing address by certified mail. Then we emailed it for good measure. I wanted Karen to know that the game had changed. But Karen didn't slow down. In fact, she doubled down. The next day I received another notice, this time marked Final Warning, listing an increased balance of $2,000, plus escalation fees. It was taped to my barn again, this time with glue instead of tape. I'd had enough. I installed 2 additional security cameras, one by the main gate and another overlooking the west entrance, and began recording everything. That same night, around 11 p.m., the cameras caught Brent, her right-hand clipboard warrior, sneaking onto my property. He wore dark clothes, carried a flashlight, and looked around nervously before hammering another paper into my oak tree. I could hear him muttering about how the board will take care of it. I called the sheriff's office, handed over the footage, and they promised to investigate. It was the first time I'd seen them actually take an HOA matter seriously. The next morning, things escalated even more. Karen showed up in person again, But this time she didn't come alone. She brought 2 other board members with her, and all of them were wearing official-looking lanyards with cheap plastic badges. They stood just outside my gate and began reading off violations with the air of government agents. Your utility shed is not color compliant with community standards. Your perimeter fencing exceeds height restrictions. Your flagpole lacks HOA approval. I interrupted her by walking out with a speaker and playing the audio of her own voice, which I had received from a friendly neighbor the day before. In the clip, Karen could be clearly heard laughing during a board meeting, saying, "He doesn't even know he's been annexed. He'll fold under pressure like the rest of them." Her face dropped immediately. One of the board members actually turned to her and said, "Wait, what is this?" I saw an opportunity and took it. I pulled out my phone and told her she had 30 seconds to leave or I would call the sheriff again. This time, she hesitated. Then she tried a new tactic. "Listen, we can work this out. If you just agree to pay a small monthly maintenance fee, we can overlook some of the other infractions." I stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "You're literally offering a bribe to avoid imaginary penalties for rules that don't apply to me. This is not a negotiation, Karen. This is you digging yourself deeper into a hole." The group left quickly after that, whispering among themselves. But I could tell the wheels in her mind were spinning. She was going to try something bigger. I could feel it. Later that evening, I got a knock on the door from my neighbor Adam. He looked nervous, like he was debating whether to speak or not. I invited him in and he handed me a flash drive. "I've been recording the board meetings," he said. "They didn't know I was still on the email list after I moved off the board. I've seen how she talks about you. How she forged the vote logs. It's not just you. She's been targeting properties near the border of the HOA to force them in and boost revenue." I plugged in the drive and listened in stunned silence. There she was again, boasting about how she could push back the HOA line a few houses at a time before anyone notices. In another clip, she mentioned plans to build a gate that would seal off my road for community security. It was like watching a dictator speak freely because she thought no one was listening. Armed with all this evidence, Sam and I began building a formal legal response. He drafted a complaint for harassment, trespassing, attempted extortion, and slander. But more importantly, we began preparing a public response. This wasn't just a legal issue anymore. It was a neighborhood issue. I printed flyers explaining my case and started handing them out to anyone even remotely curious. Most were stunned. Some were angry. A few had their own stories. One older couple said they paid $400 in fees last year for drainage repairs on a street they didn't live on. Another neighbor admitted he paved his driveway just to avoid Karen's daily note. The pattern was clear. Karen had built her empire on silence, fear, and confusion. And I was about to bring the whole thing down. I dropped off a copy of the recordings at the local news station. A reporter named Michelle called me back within hours. She said they'd been looking into shady HOA activity in the area for months but couldn't get anyone to go on record. I told her I'd go live on camera with every document I had. I wanted the world to see what Karen had done, and how far she was willing to go to maintain control. Michelle scheduled a segment for the following Friday. That gave me 4 days to gather every piece of proof I could find and prepare for what might become a very public battle. That night, sitting on my porch with the sound of crickets and the glow of my floodlights bouncing off the fence, I felt something I hadn't felt since the mess began. I felt calm, not because it was over, far from it, but because I knew I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone, and Karen had finally picked a fight she couldn't win by waving a clipboard. By the time Friday rolled around, word of the upcoming news segment had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. I didn't expect much at first, maybe a few curious glances or some extra cars parked near my place, but what I got was something else entirely. When I pulled out of my driveway that morning, a crowd had already gathered on the sidewalk across from my property. Some held coffee mugs and lawn chairs. Others had their phones out. And right in the middle of it all stood Karen, wearing a crimson blazer, dark sunglasses, and a face that looked like it had chewed glass for breakfast. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to perform. And perform she did. She had somehow organized an impromptu HOA board meeting in my driveway, complete with folding chairs, branded water bottles, and printed pamphlets labeled Community Standards Emergency Enforcement. As I walked past, she raised her voice, making sure everyone could hear her. We are gathered today to address a serious threat to community values and unity. One resident has refused to acknowledge the HOA's role in preserving neighborhood integrity. She didn't say my name, but her glare never left my direction. I kept walking, biting the inside of my cheek to stop from laughing. It was like watching a parody sketch come to life. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She was doing all the damage herself. Later that day, the news crew arrived. Michelle, the reporter I'd spoken to, was even more excited than I was. You wouldn't believe how many emails we've gotten about this HOA since we announced the story, she said while setting up. Looks like you cracked something wide open. I handed over the flash drive again, just to be sure they had every recording. Then I laid out all the notices Karen had sent me, the forged minutes from her supposed meeting, and the footage of Brent sneaking onto my property. Michelle was like a kid in a candy store. She even managed to get a few interviews with my neighbors, who had their own horror stories to share. The segment aired that night on the local news, and it hit like a bomb. The headline was blunt and beautiful. Local man fights HOA overreach with receipt. They played the audio of Karen admitting she expanded the HOA without consent, showed footage of her board meeting circus in my driveway, and ended the segment with a clip of me saying, "I don't owe them a dime, and I'm not even in their HOA." The station's switchboard lit up within minutes. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years started knocking on my door with their own paperwork. People from other subdivisions emailed me copies of similar letters they'd received. Karen's little empire wasn't just collapsing. It was exploding. The next day, I went into town for errands and couldn't believe how many people stopped me. A woman at the gas station clapped me on the back. A cashier at the grocery store offered me a discount. Even a group of high school kids on bikes shouted, "HOA Warrior," as they rode past. I didn't ask for any of this, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a little satisfying. Meanwhile, Karen had gone into full crisis mode. She posted on the neighborhood forum claiming the news segment was selectively edited, and that I had doctored audio. No one bought it. Screenshots of her old posts contradicted everything she claimed. Her desperation was showing, and everyone could see it. But she wasn't done yet. No, Karen had one more card to play, and it was the stupidest one of all. She decided to sue me. I got the notice a few days later. She had filed a small claims suit for unpaid dues and defamation. My lawyer Sam nearly fell out of his chair laughing. "She's actually suing you for calling her out on the truth? This'll be fun." We gathered every shred of evidence, including the deed, the city records, and witness statements from neighbors. Sam even subpoenaed the HOA's financials, just in case we needed more dirt. What we got back shocked even him. There were irregularities everywhere, mismatched expenses, vague payments labeled as event consulting, and even a $900 charge to a seafood restaurant listed as board strategy dinner. The more we dug, the worse it got. Court day arrived and the room was packed. Not just with legal folks, but with curious residents, angry neighbors, and even a couple of local reporters. Karen walked in wearing a power suit and an expression that screamed denial. She sat down with a folder that looked suspiciously empty and gave me a smirk like she thought she had already won. The judge walked in, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a tired tone. Karen was called up first. She launched into a dramatic speech about community standards and civic responsibility. She claimed I had been a disruptive force, that I refused to follow guidelines, and that my refusal to pay dues had endangered neighborhood morale. Then she accused me of slander for broadcasting lies to the media. The judge held up a hand. Do you have any signed documentation proving he is part of your HOA? Karen paused, shuffled her papers, and then held up the forged vote logs. Sam stood. Your Honor, those documents were fabricated. We have proof, including a recorded statement from the defendant admitting to their creation. Karen's face twitched. That recording is illegal. It was taken without my consent. The judge raised an eyebrow. So you're confirming the voice on the recording is yours? There was a brief, delicious silence. Then Karen muttered something about context. The courtroom broke into murmurs. The judge banged her gavel. This court finds the defendant not liable for any dues, fees, or penalties. Furthermore, I recommend this matter be referred to the district attorney for potential fraud investigation. Karen turned pale. She didn't say another word. As she left the courtroom, someone from the audience clapped slowly. Then a second person joined. And a third. By the time I walked out, the whole hallway was applauding. It felt surreal. Not because I had won, but because someone like her had actually been stopped. For once, entitlement had consequences. That night, I sat on my porch again, just like I had weeks before. Only this time, the air felt lighter. There were no flyers on my gate, no strangers pacing outside my fence, no fake citations nailed to trees. It was quiet, peaceful. I knew the battle wasn't completely over yet. Karen was too stubborn to let it die easily, but I had turned the tide. And I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every neighbor she had ever bullied, every retiree she had tricked, every family she had intimidated with made-up rules and fake fines. And deep down, I knew she had one more move left. Something desperate. Something stupid. Because Karen wasn't just losing control. She was unraveling. And I was more than ready for what came next. The week following the courtroom collapse of Karen's case was like the eye of a storm, quiet, surreal, and unnerving. The HOA had gone unusually silent, and not a single flyer or citation appeared on my gate. For the first time in months, I could mow the grass without watching my back or checking for clipboard-carrying invaders. But that peace didn't last long. One of my neighbors, Mr. Dawson, came by on a Wednesday morning holding a letter. It was another HOA notice, but this time not from Karen, it was from someone else on the board. The problem was, almost everyone on the board had resigned. Karen had burned through them like kindling, and her last few loyal followers were starting to jump ship. Still, someone had clearly taken up her mission, and the letter was a desperate attempt to reassert control. That same day, word spread that Brent, the self-proclaimed compliance officer, who had been Karen's attack dog from the start, had stepped down. He didn't leave quietly, though. According to a post on the neighborhood forum, Brent had recorded a video rant where he blamed Karen for turning what was supposed to be a friendly community organization into a personal dictatorship. He even admitted on camera that many of the citations he delivered were based on nothing, and said he felt ashamed for harassing people who were just trying to live their lives. The video spread quickly, especially after someone clipped the part where Brent said, "I'd rather work mall security than deal with her again." With Brent out and the rest of the board in chaos, Karen was left standing alone. For someone who thrived on control and validation, being abandoned was probably the worst thing that could have happened to her. But instead of backing down, she went completely unhinged. She started sending out emails under a new title, Community Emergency Coordinator, and claimed the HOA had the right to declare a localized state of residential order. No one could even figure out what that meant, but her emails were filled with wild threats, including the enforcement of temporary curfews and outdoor decor restrictions for psychological aesthetics. It read like a manifesto written during a breakdown. People started screenshotting the emails and posting them online with sarcastic captions. Memes followed. One showed her face photoshopped onto a dictator's body with the caption, "The lawn must obey." Things hit a new level when a city investigator finally responded to all the complaints and news coverage. An official audit was launched, and not just into the HOA's authority, into their finances. Within days, an unmarked sedan parked outside the HOA office and two men in plain suits walked in carrying briefcases. I heard from a friend at City Hall that the HOA's financial records had raised red flags for months, but they'd been buried under red tape. Now that a judge had spotlighted the situation, the investigation had teeth. The next morning, copies of the audit notice were taped to the HOA building's front windows. It was like a bomb had gone off in Karen's world. I didn't see her for a few days, but that changed during the weekend. She was outside pacing the sidewalk in front of my property, phone pressed to her ear, ranting about retaliatory sabotage and media conspiracies. I watched from a distance as she tried flagging down cars, even stopping a young couple walking their dog to give them a handwritten flyer. They tossed it in the trash before they even reached the end of the street. Whatever authority she once claimed was gone. The only people who still gave her the time of day were the ones looking for entertainment. It wasn't just that people didn't fear her anymore. They were actively laughing at her. On Monday, a sheriff's deputy showed up at Karen's house with a summons. Apparently, someone on the old board had filed a report about financial misconduct. She stood on her porch and shouted at him, waving her hands and threatening to sue for harassment. He stayed calm, handed her the envelope, and walked away. The next morning, her house had a "For Sale by Owner" sign staked in the yard. She hadn't even tried to hide it anymore. Her once immaculate lawn was overgrown, the ornamental shrubs she'd bragged about were dry and dying, and the little sign reading "President HOA" was gone from her porch. But just when it seemed like the saga was nearing its end, another twist hit. I was fixing a broken fence post when a black SUV pulled up outside my gate. A woman in a tailored suit stepped out and introduced herself as part of the state compliance office. Apparently, the HOA hadn't just overstepped locally, they had been operating without up-to-date nonprofit paperwork, and several residents had filed complaints that their dues had been spent on personal expenses. The woman asked if I would be willing to provide documentation of everything I had experienced. I handed over the full folder. She took one look at the labels and said, "You've basically built our whole case already." Later that night, someone leaked HOA financial documents to the neighborhood group chat. The findings were worse than anyone imagined. Karen had charged the HOA over $5,000 for strategic planning retreats, which turned out to be spa weekends at a resort 3 hours away. There were also invoices for personal landscaping work done at her house, paid for with HOA funds. One line item simply read "Privacy Enhancement Project" and was for $900, which turned out to be tinted windows for her SUV. Her explanation, according to the leak, was that it enhanced her focus as an administrator. People were furious. Even those who had defended her began calling for a full dissolution of the HOA. The final straw came a few days later when she was caught in the act. A neighbor named Paula had installed a discreet wildlife camera on a tree in her front yard to track a raccoon problem. Instead, the camera captured footage of Karen sneaking onto her porch at midnight and taping a new community notice to her door. It warned Paula that she was in violation of nighttime lighting standards. The clip went viral in under an hour. Karen was seen in her pajamas, stumbling into a planter, and muttering about neighborhood disrespect. By morning, she was trending locally with the nickname Midnight Karen. That afternoon, she was arrested. It wasn't some dramatic chase or a swarm of flashing lights, it was quiet and quick. 2 officers knocked, she opened the door, and after a brief conversation, they walked her to the car in handcuffs. The entire street watched in silence. Then someone cheered. Then another. By the time the cruiser rolled away, half the block had erupted into applause. No one was happy to see someone's life implode. But they were relieved. They were done living in fear of citations, fines, and clipboard threat. I stood at the edge of my porch, hands in my pockets, watching as Karen's legacy of intimidation was hauled away in the back of a squad car. There was no satisfaction in her fall, only clarity. This had never been about dues or fences or paint colors. It had been about control. And once that grip was broken, the entire structure crumbled. The board was gone, the office was closed, and the HOA sign at the community entrance now leaned sideways, partially covered in vines. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. Karen's reign was over. The days following Karen's arrest were strangely quiet, like the entire neighborhood had exhaled at once. There were no more sudden rule changes, no more midnight patrols, no threats stuffed under doormats, and for the first time in months, people were smiling without glancing over their shoulders. The HOA office, once bustling with nervous residents and Karen's forced cheerfulness, was now locked up with yellow tape on the windows and a city seal reading, "Under investigation." No one dared go near it. Even the new residents, who had moved in during the height of Karen's reign and had no idea what peace in this neighborhood felt like, could sense the shift in the air. It was like the sun had come out after a long storm, and everyone was learning how to live again. I spent most of that week helping neighbors go through their old notices and fraudulent fee slip. Some of them were too scared to believe it was really over. One elderly woman cried when I told her she never had to pay another dime to the HOA again. She'd spent nearly $2,000 over 2 years out of fear. Another family, who had nearly been sued for putting a swing set in their backyard, brought over a pie just to say thank you. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't do anything that most people wouldn't have done in my shoes. But the truth was, nobody else had pushed back. Most people don't realize how easy it is for someone like Karen to take power, not through authority but through intimidation, paperwork, and a whole lot of noise. Then came the HOA's asset auction. With the entire board gone and the legal investigation uncovering mountains of financial abuse, the city ordered all remaining HOA property to be liquidated. It wasn't a fancy event, just a quiet setup in the community center parking lot. Most people went out of curiosity. I went because I had my eye on one very specific item. At the far end of the lot, leaning against a folding table like a forgotten trophy, was the original red Cedar Trails community welcome sign. It was a 6-foot-tall wooden slab with carved letters and a fake ivy trim, designed to look grand but mostly just looked pretentious. It was the same sign Karen had proudly posed in front of for the community newsletter every year. I bid $20 on it. No one else even raised a hand. The sign now hangs sideways on the inside of my fence. I rotated it 90 degrees so it reads top-down, like a fallen totem pole, and stenciled underneath in bold black paint the words, "Never again." It's not meant to be petty. It's meant to be a reminder that power only exists when people let it grow unchecked, that no one should ever be bullied out of their own land by clipboards and fake rules. And maybe just a little because I knew Karen would hate it. But the story didn't end with Karen behind bars and a dusty auction. About a month later, something strange happened. A new woman moved into Karen's old house. No one thought much of it at first. The listing had been anonymous and the sale closed fast. The woman claimed she was a community consultant looking to help neighborhoods restructure after HOA dissolutions. She wore big sunglasses, had oddly familiar hand gestures, and constantly talked about restoring neighborhood pride. It didn't take long for someone to realize what was going on. Karen was back. Same voice, different name. She had dyed her hair and changed her wardrobe, but her mouth still ran at full speed. She made it 1 week before getting caught. One evening she knocked on Paula's door, the same neighbor whose wildlife camera had sealed her fate, and tried to hand her a pamphlet about voluntary code adoption. Paula didn't even hesitate. She slammed the door, walked straight into her backyard, and shouted across the fence, "She's back." Within 20 minutes, half the street was outside. Cameras were rolling. Phones were live. Karen, or rather Cheryl, tried to deny everything. She claimed it was a coincidence, that she was new here, that she didn't know anything about the past issues. But someone played a clip from her old news segment and another from the porch camera. Same tone, same cadence, same mannerisms. Caught again. No one called the cops this time. There was no need. She packed up that night and was gone by morning, leaving behind a half-unpacked moving truck and a house that still smelled like guilt and gardenia air freshener. That was the last time anyone saw her in the neighborhood. In the aftermath, something unexpected happened. The community didn't just heal, it reinvented itself. Without the HOA hovering overhead, people started talking more. Front porches became social spaces again. Yard sales popped up without being shut down. Flags went up. Garden lights stayed on. People started helping each other instead of filing complaint. And somewhere in that messy, beautiful change, we created something stronger than Karen's fake authority ever was. A neighborhood. A real one. We even held a barbecue in my front yard as a kind of unofficial celebration. Everyone brought something: brisket, potato salad, soda, stories. We joked about starting our own HOA just to elect a golden retriever as president. Kids played on the same swing set that had once been threatened with fines. Retired couples danced on the lawn under string lights. The man who had been too afraid to put up Halloween decorations the year before came dressed as a giant gavel. It was a beautiful kind of ridiculous. I looked around and realized just how close we'd all come to losing this. Not just property or freedom, but each other. Fear builds fences, but laughter tears them down. Karen had tried to build a kingdom out of fear and paper threats, and for a while, it worked. But in the end, the truth came out. And the community rose. Sometimes I still catch people slowing down outside my gate to read the sign hanging sideways. Some smile. Some shake their heads. A few stop to take pictures. To me, it's more than a souvenir. It's a symbol of every voice that said no, every neighbor who stood up, and every quiet battle fought behind fences and hedges. It's the last chapter in a story that shouldn't have had to be written, but one I'm proud to have told. Because I never owed them a dime. Because I never signed up for their rules. Because I wasn't in their HOA. And because I never backed down.